A poor little girl places a rose on a millionaire's wife's grave. What she says makes him collapse. Rain tapped softly against the brim of Garrett Hale's black umbrella as he stood in silence before a polished marble gravestone. The name Elena Hale shimmered in silver letters beneath a single line, "Beloved Wife." The man in the tailored coat, the type worn by men who built empires, looked nothing like the broken shell he felt inside. 5 years had passed, yet this moment, this grave, still twisted something inside him that success could never soothe. He had brought lilies, her favorite, and laid them carefully at the base of the headstone, brushing away stray leaves as if that small gesture could somehow make up for everything. Then he heard soft footsteps behind him. At first, he didn't turn. Cemeteries weren't empty, not even on rainy mornings. But then came the voice, small, fragile, and trembling. "Hi, Mommy. I'm sorry we couldn't find you sooner." He turned. A little girl, no more than 6, stood beside him. Her clothes were threadbare, her coat too big and stained, her shoes soaked through. She held a wilted rose in her hand and placed it gently on Elena's grave. Garrett's breath caught in his chest. "What did you say?" The girl didn't look at him. Her small fingers brushed the cold stone, and she leaned her forehead gently against it. "We looked everywhere. I kept us safe like you said. I didn't cry when it got cold." Garrett took a step back, suddenly unsteady. His pulse pounded in his ears. Her voice, her eyes, hazel, just like Elena's. And her face. Not an exact match, no, but close enough to make his knees weaken. "What's your name?" he asked, voice strained. "Sophie," she whispered. He stared at the girl. The name hit him like a punch. Sophie. That was the name Elena had picked out, back when they still talked about having children. Before everything fell apart, before the betrayal, the silence, the vanishing. He knelt slowly, trying to make sense of the storm rising inside him. "Sophie, who is your mommy?" The girl looked up at him with cautious eyes, as if she'd answered this question many times before and never been believed. "Elena. But she used to go by Lena Hart where we lived, before she got sick." Garrett's heart dropped. Lena Hart. It wasn't a name he recognized, but the combination was hauntingly plausible. Elena Hale had vanished after their final argument, after walking out with nothing but a suitcase. He never filed a missing persons report. She didn't want to be found, he thought. And when the hospital called a year later to inform him she had passed from heart failure, with no known address listed for next of kin, he thought that was the end of it. She had left, chosen to disappear. But now this child was telling a different story. "I live at the shelter now," Sophie said, her voice smaller than before. "With my brother Aiden. He's 3. He doesn't talk much." Brother. Another child. Garrett's vision blurred. The air around him seemed too thin to breathe. Sophie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a photo, creased and faded. It was a picture of Elena cradling a baby, smiling through exhaustion. She was thinner, older, but unmistakably her. Garrett held the photo with trembling hands. "I don't have a daddy," Sophie said almost apologetically. "Mommy never talked about him. Only said he was rich, but he couldn't keep us safe." Garrett's chest tightened. He didn't even realize he had knelt into the damp grass until the cold seeped through his trousers. The gravity of what he was seeing and hearing pressed down with unbearable weight. Elena had left to protect her children. "From what?" "I'm sorry," Sophie said suddenly, taking a small step back. "I didn't mean to take your space. I just wanted to say goodbye." "No," Garrett managed, his voice hoarse. You're not in the way." 1,000 questions tore through his mind, but none of them mattered now. The only thing he knew, truly knew, was that this child, standing in the rain, had Elena's eyes. and there was no universe in which he could walk away now. Garrett had always believed that truth was something clean. Sharp, maybe, but clean. It cut through lies, clarified motives, simplified messes. But standing in his car outside the shelter Sophie mentioned, gripping the steering wheel like it was the last thing holding him together, he realized truth was messy. And sometimes it arrived in the shape of a 6-year-old girl with her mother's eyes. The shelter director, a woman named Miss Carmen, was cautious when he arrived. "You said your name is Garrett Hale?" He nodded. "The children mentioned a man at the cemetery. Sophie said you looked surprised." Carmen folded her arms, eyeing him with polite skepticism. "She also said you cried." Garrett didn't deny it. "I think I might be their father." That changed everything. Inside, the shelter was warm but cramped, with walls decorated by children's drawings and donated coats. It didn't belong to the world Garrett came from, the world of glass offices, leather chairs, and catered lunches. This place smelled like soup, dust, and too many people trying to survive on too little. Sophie ran up to him, her brother trailing behind her with wide, wary eyes. Aiden clutched a worn stuffed animal and stood half-hidden behind his sister. "He doesn't talk much," Sophie whispered again, patting her brother's shoulder like she was twice her age. "But he's brave." Garrett knelt to their level. "I believe that." Carmen brought out Elena's old belongings. A duffel bag, a few notebooks, some letters, and a USB drive taped to the back of a photo frame. Garrett felt a lump form in his throat when he saw his wife's handwriting, still round and careful, still full of emotion she could never speak aloud. One notebook was labeled simply, "Sophie and Aiden, for when I can't be here." He didn't open it yet. Instead, he listened. Carmen told him how Elena had checked into the shelter using the name Lena Hart, heavily pregnant, scared, and paranoid. She worked odd jobs under the table, refused help from distant relatives, and never explained where she'd come from. She always said someone was watching, said she had to keep the kids away from someone dangerous, Carmen said. She was kind, but broken. And Garrett remembered the final fight, the words they'd hurled, the disbelief in her voice when he told her to leave if she couldn't trust him. She hadn't just left him. She had fled. Back at his penthouse, Garrett stood surrounded by silence. Designer furniture, untouched kitchenware, cold luxury. The home that once felt powerful now felt empty. No crayons on the table, no blankets on the floor, no noise. He placed the USB drive into his laptop. A folder appeared. "To Garrett, if you ever find them?" He hesitated before opening it. Elena's voice crackled to life through the speakers. "If you're watching this, it means the children are safe. I prayed you'd never see it. But if you are, you need to know the truth." Her voice trembled as she spoke of Victor Lang, Garrett's former business partner. She had discovered things: fraud, blackmail, and something darker: threats, aimed at her and the children. She left to protect them, believing Garrett was too close to Victor to see the danger. "I didn't know who to trust," she said. "You loved him like a brother. I didn't think you'd believe me." She had recorded conversations, screenshots, bank transfers. Evidence Garrett had never dreamed existed. He sat motionless for a long time, staring at the dark screen long after the video ended. He had failed her. But maybe it wasn't too late to protect what she died trying to save. The next morning, Garrett Hale arrived at Langford Industries, not as a CEO, but as a father. The polished lobby, the security guards who greeted him with robotic nods, the silence of elevator doors sliding shut. It all felt unfamiliar now. The world he had built, brick by brick, had no room for the truth he now carried. Victor Lang was waiting in the executive lounge, sipping his usual macchiato, wearing a smug grin. "Well, well, haven't seen you since the gala. To what do I owe this early reunion?" Garrett didn't sit. "I know about Elena," he said flatly, And the children. Victor's face twitched just for a moment. Then, children? Garrett, if you've been reading conspiracy blogs again. I saw the recordings. That changed everything. Victor stood up slowly, placing his cup on the table with precise calm. You've always had a flair for the dramatic. I hope you haven't come here to accuse me of something dangerous. Garrett stepped closer. You threatened her. She ran to protect our kids. And now, she's dead. Victor's expression finally cracked. I didn't kill her. No, but you scared her into hiding. And you knew. You knew they were mine. The room turned heavy with silence. Victor exhaled sharply like a man reconsidering his next chess move. So what? She didn't trust you. That's not on me. Garrett didn't argue. He'd come for confirmation. And now he had it. The data on Elena's USB drive was damning. If he took it to the authorities now, Victor would spiral. But Garrett needed to play it smarter. He needed leverage, not just a moral victory, but a legal one. Meanwhile, Sophie and Aiden moved into Garrett's home. Miss Carmen helped with the transition, and so did Olivia, Garrett's assistant, who for the first time saw a different side of him. The penthouse shifted from pristine to lived-in. Crayon drawings appeared on marble counters. Aiden's blanket trailed across Persian rugs. Sophie began to smile more, though her eyes still watched every exit. Garrett struggled. He didn't know how to braid hair or explain nightmares. He didn't know how to comfort a toddler or answer Sophie's questions like, "Why did Mommy die scared?" But he was learning. Each night he read from Elena's journal, her hopes for the kids, the rules she lived by, the fears she had. It helped. Slowly, painfully, it helped him feel like he could become the man they needed. And then came the subpoena. Victor had preemptively filed a claim for defamation, intended to silence Garrett and block any evidence from reaching court. It was a tactical move. And it meant war. Garrett consulted with legal counsel, investigators, and a security firm. He hired someone to dig deeper into Victor's offshore accounts, and the results were worse than expected. Money laundering, hush funds, and connections to 2 missing whistleblowers. The man who once stood beside him on magazine covers was now a walking scandal in waiting. Garrett could feel the pressure closing in. If he pushed too hard, Victor might retaliate, legally, financially, even violently. But if he held back, Sophie and Aiden would never be safe. He thought about Elena, about the way her voice had cracked in the recording when she begged him to believe her. He wouldn't fail her again. One evening, Sophie found Garrett sitting in the dark, laptop open, the weight of the decision eating at him. "Are you sad?" she asked, climbing into the chair beside him. He turned, surprised she was awake. "A little. Do you miss her too?" He nodded. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out something crumpled. A drawing. Stick figures. Her, Aiden, Elena, and Garrett. "I made a new one," she said softly. "Mommy said if we ever found you I should give this to you." Garrett felt something inside him collapse. He took the paper with shaking hands. "I love you, Daddy," she said. It was the first time she had called him that. Garrett wasn't prepared for how quickly parenthood exposed his faults. Balancing board meetings with breakfast routines, prepping legal evidence while helping Sophie with spelling. It was chaos, but it was also grounding. For the first time in years, his life had purpose beyond profit margins. Still, every moment of peace came with a shadow. Victor Lang wasn't sitting quietly. He had influence, connections, and secrets buried in the same soil where Garrett had once planted his empire. Whispers began circulating in the media. Was Hale mentally unfit after his wife's death? Had he fabricated claims to cover financial misconduct? It wasn't accidental. Victor was launching a smear campaign. At the same time, a new figure entered the picture. Marla Chen, a former investigative journalist who had tried to expose Victor years ago, until her story was silenced and her reputation tarnished. Garrett's team contacted her quietly, offering access to Elena's evidence. Marla hesitated at first, but after reviewing the materials, especially the voice memos Elena had recorded in her final weeks, she agreed to help. Her Substack newsletter had recently gained traction, and she proposed a full exposé titled "The Man Behind the Silence: Victor Lang's Hidden Empire." But there was risk. Publishing too soon could provoke retaliation. "Timing is everything," she told Garrett. "If I push before you're legally protected, he'll bury you. And me." So they waited. In the meantime, Garrett focused on building trust at home. One day, Olivia, the assistant who had quietly kept Garrett's life running for years, brought a box from storage. "This was Elena's," she said. "She left it in the office during your separation." Inside were old letters, ultrasound prints, and a sealed envelope addressed to "My husband, if he ever forgives me." The letter inside was raw. Elena confessed that she hadn't trusted Garrett, not because he was dangerous, but because he was blind to the dangers around him. She wrote about her fear that Victor was untouchable, and her heartbreak over leaving without saying goodbye. Garrett folded the letter, tears threatening. Sophie peeked into the room. "What's that?" He smiled gently. "A letter from your mom. She wanted us to have it." Sophie nodded. "Can I write her one too?" That night Garrett helped her write it, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the rose she insisted on keeping in a glass of water. As pressure mounted, Garrett's lawyers prepared a counteroffensive. He couldn't destroy Victor in a courtroom alone, but he could create a coordinated attack, a media exposé, financial whistleblowing, and a full submission to federal investigators. It was risky, but it was clean. Elena's recordings, Sophie's custody, even the shelter's logs all aligned. Victor was running out of room to hide, but there was one final twist. Marla called one night with a revelation. One of Victor's enforcers, the same man who had followed Elena years ago, had died in a suspicious accident just days earlier. "They're tying up loose ends," she warned. "We have to move now." The air inside the federal prosecutor's office was sterile, clinical, and completely unlike the boardrooms Garrett Hale was used to. But as he handed over the folder, thick with evidence, letters, and digital files, he didn't feel fear. He felt clarity. He had come to the office not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a father, a man who had failed once and wouldn't do it again. "We'll open an investigation immediately," the agent said after scanning the documents. "This is substantial." Garrett nodded. "It's not just about him. It's about who he silenced, who he terrified, and who's still scared." He left the building without a press conference, without fanfare, but by the time he returned to his car, the first domino had already tipped. That same day, Marla Chen's article went live. The Silent War, Victor Lang, Corporate Corruption, and the Family He Tried to Bury. The piece exploded across social media and news platforms. Inside were screenshots, transcripts, audio recordings, evidence gathered by Elena in her final months. There were even photographs of shelter records, showing the alias she used and the lengths she took to remain hidden. But it wasn't just data, it was story. Marla's writing painted a vivid picture of a mother running from power, of a woman betrayed by proximity, of two children born into fear. And at the center, Victor Lang, a man who had built a kingdom on silence and intimidation. The fallout came fast. Langford Industries lost 11% in stock value within hours. News vans gathered outside corporate headquarters. Anonymous employees began leaking internal emails. 3 board members resigned by evening. Victor Lang issued a public statement. Outlandish claims by a disgruntled former associate. No truth, no proof. But Garrett had already submitted that proof to federal authorities. And Victor knew it. That night, the warning came. Garrett returned home to find his penthouse ransacked, papers scattered, cabinets torn open. Elena's notebook gone. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing of monetary value had been taken. It was a message. He called Olivia immediately, confirming that Sophie and Aiden, thankfully, were still with her, safe and unaware. Then he called security, then Carmen, then his lawyer. Then he sat in the dark and shook. Because no matter how much evidence he had, no matter how powerful the truth seemed, Victor wasn't just a man being exposed. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals lash out. The next day, Garrett relocated the children to a secure home outside the city. Cameras were installed, guards discreetly stationed. He took a leave from Langford's board, publicly framed as a family sabbatical. Privately, it was a tactical withdrawal. He needed focus. He also needed help. Marla, sensing the escalation, reached out with news. A source had contacted her anonymously. A man claiming to be Victor's former assistant, Brent Collins, wanted to talk, but only in person. Garrett agreed. They met at a diner off the highway. Brent looked worn, anxious. He didn't order anything, just slid a flash drive across the table and said, "I saw what you and your wife went through. I stayed quiet. I shouldn't have." Garrett took the drive but didn't open it. "What's on it?" "Security footage, emails, messages from Victor." Elena wasn't paranoid. He really was following her. He knew she had your kids, and he said. Brent hesitated. "He said you'd never find out unless she died." Garrett's hands tightened around the flash drive. "Why tell me now?" Brent looked away. "Because I have a daughter too, and after reading that article I couldn't sleep." Garrett stood. "You did the right thing. Now we finish this." Back home, Garrett didn't tell Sophie everything, but he told her enough. "We're going to make sure the bad man can't hurt anyone else," he said, kneeling beside her bed. Sophie held her stuffed dog close. "Because of Mommy?" "Yes," he said. "Because she was brave. And because you are too." She reached under her pillow and handed him something. Another drawing. Stick figures again. This time, there were 4. Sophie, Aiden, Mommy, and Garrett. "She said if we ever found you, I should give this to you." He unfolded it carefully. In childish handwriting, above the figures, was written, "My family." The next morning, the news broke again. The Department of Justice had officially launched an investigation into Victor Lang. And for the first time in years, Garrett Hale allowed himself a quiet moment of hope. In the days following the DOJ announcement, Garrett's life became a careful balancing act between chaos and calm. His name surged across headlines, often alongside Victor Lang's, but the tone had shifted. Garrett was no longer painted as the silent partner or negligent executive. He was now the man who had exposed a corporate monster, and the father who had fought for children he never knew he had. But behind closed doors, the cost was mounting. Every hour brought new updates, legal statements, court filings, emergency board meetings, requests for interviews. Garrett turned down every spotlight opportunity. He didn't want to be the center of the story. Elena was, and more importantly, Sophie and Aiden were. At the safe house, daily life took on a new rhythm. Olivia helped manage tutoring and grocery runs. Sophie began smiling more, even laughing at Garrett's awkward jokes. Aiden still didn't talk, but he followed Garrett everywhere, clutching his pant leg, mimicking how he walked, reaching up to hold his hand in crowded rooms. One night, Garrett watched the 2 kids asleep on the couch, wrapped in the same fleece blanket. Their breathing was soft, synchronized. The TV still hummed in the background with a cartoon episode looping. And for a moment, the world outside didn't matter. That's when Carmen called. "There's something you need to hear," she said, voice tight. One of the caseworkers just came forward. She remembers Elena. Says she used to mail something every 2 weeks, a sealed envelope. Where to? Garrett asked. To a P.O. box in D.C. It was under your name. Garrett's pulse spiked. He had never rented a P.O. box, not during their marriage, not after. He asked Carmen to forward the details. Later that night, Garrett sat on the floor, Elena's journal open beside him. Page after page of notes about the kids, feeding schedules, favorite bedtime songs, things that made them cry. At the back was a new page he hadn't noticed before. Drawings. Of him. Rough sketches in ink. Garrett at a distance. Garrett in the newspaper. Garrett on a stage, giving a speech. All drawn from memory. And in one, Elena had drawn him holding a baby, labeled, Sophie, if you're reading this, he's your dad. The next day, Garrett went to the post office listed by Carmen. At first, the clerk was hesitant. But when Garrett showed his ID, the man's demeanor shifted. Box 122. It's been empty for years. But wait. He rummaged behind the counter and pulled out a sealed envelope. This came in last week. We weren't sure what to do with it. Garrett opened it in his car. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten. Not by Elena. It was Brent. He had delivered physical backup copies of all the digital files, just in case anything went missing. Garrett opened the USB stick inside and found one more recording Elena had made. Never seen before. In it, Elena sits near a window. She's older, tired, and her eyes carry a quiet strength. If you're seeing this, I guess everything's out now. And if you're with the kids, if you're reading to Sophie, if Aiden's climbing on your lap, then I was right to trust you one last time. She smiles. You always had more heart than you believed. I just wish I'd said it sooner. Garrett paused the video and pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes. He hadn't lost her completely. She had left pieces behind. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Garrett Hale had ever experienced. He wasn't just rebuilding his reputation, he was rebuilding himself. And for the first time in years, he felt like each step had meaning. Every decision wasn't just a legal maneuver or a media calculation. It was about Sophie, about Aiden, about Elena, and about becoming the kind of man he wished she could have seen him become. Parenthood had humbled him fast. One night Sophie had a nightmare and wouldn't stop crying. Garrett tried to comfort her, but nothing worked. She clung to the small stuffed bear her mother had given her, eyes wide and panicked. I want Mommy, she sobbed. Garrett swallowed the lump in his throat. I know, sweetheart. I miss her too. He sat beside her bed the entire night, telling her stories about when he and Elena first met. How she once burned pancakes so badly the fire alarm went off. How she used to sing in the car louder than the radio. Slowly, Sophie calmed. She curled against him, the weight of grief momentarily softened by memory. Meanwhile, Aiden started speaking. It happened during breakfast. Garrett had spilled orange juice and muttered under his breath. Sophie giggled. And then Aiden, with his fork in hand and cheeks full of eggs, looked at Garrett and said, Oops, just one word. But it made Garrett freeze, then smile, then cry quietly into his napkin. Aiden blinked at him, confused. Dada? Garrett nodded, voice shaking. Yeah, buddy. That's me. He didn't correct the name, didn't hesitate. He just accepted it. At the same time, the case against Victor was gaining traction. Investigators uncovered layers of shell companies, hush payments, and bribery. Brent continued cooperating. Marla's follow-up reports exposed internal cover-ups that spanned years. But Garrett had made a promise, to Sophie, to Elena, to himself. The case would not come at the cost of the children's peace. So he shielded them. No interviews. No cameras. No more surprises. He turned down documentary offers, book deals, and even a televised feature. When a journalist cornered him outside a courthouse and asked, "What do you hope to gain from all this?" Garrett simply said, "My daughter's trust." Then he walked away. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer in the safe house, Garrett found something unexpected. A sealed envelope addressed to Sophie in Elena's handwriting. He debated opening it, but when he handed it to Sophie that night, she just nodded solemnly and said, "She told me you'd help me read it." The letter was short. "My sweet girl, if you're reading this, it means the world is finally safe enough for you to know your whole story. That means I did my job, and maybe your dad did his too. Be brave, be kind, and always remember, your story didn't start in fear. It started in love." Mommy Sophie hugged the letter to her chest. "She really loved him, didn't she?" Garrett looked down. "Yeah, she did. And he loves us too," Sophie added quietly. It wasn't a question. Garrett's growth wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when the pressure of court proceedings and parenthood collided and left him feeling hollow. There were mornings he missed conference calls because Aiden wouldn't stop crying, or nights when Sophie's grief returned in waves and left her sleepless. But he was no longer alone. He had Olivia, who had transitioned from assistant to something more like family. He had Carmen, who visited regularly and helped the children feel grounded. And he had the memory of Elena, her letters, her voice, her resilience, guiding him like a lighthouse. One evening, Garrett stood at the backyard fence of the safe house, watching Sophie help Aiden chase fireflies. The setting sun turned their hair gold. Their laughter carried into the air like music. He felt a hand rest gently on his shoulder. It was Olivia. "You're doing good," she said. He didn't answer. He just watched the children and whispered, "She would have loved this." And for the first time, he didn't feel the ache of loss as something that hollowed him out. It was something that filled him, that shaped him, that changed him. The investigation was nearing its final stage. Victor Lang had gone silent. His legal team had withdrawn from public comment, and rumors swirled that a plea deal was being discussed behind closed doors. Garrett knew it was a tactic. Victor was calculating, never quiet without reason. Which meant something was coming. But this time, Garrett was ready. At the safe house, life had taken on a kind of quiet rhythm. Mornings were slow, breakfasts were shared. Sophie practiced spelling at the kitchen table while Aiden sat beside her coloring in wide, careful strokes. Garrett, once the man who signed billion-dollar contracts before sunrise, now spent those hours folding laundry or helping with homework. But his mind never stopped working. He had received a call from the district attorney's office. Victor's team was planning a counterclaim. They intended to frame Elena as mentally unstable, suggesting the recordings were fabricated, her accusations the result of paranoia and emotional trauma. It was a low blow, and a dangerous one. Garrett slammed the phone down, furious. For a moment he felt like the old version of himself, the one who solved problems with force and money. But this wasn't a boardroom war. This was personal. Elena wasn't here to defend herself. He would have to do it for her. That night, he went through Elena's files again, line by line, audio by audio. Then he found it, a second audio file with an identical timestamp to one of Victor's meetings. Elena had recorded Victor threatening her in person and then narrating what had just happened in a private log. It was long, detailed, and emotional. It couldn't be faked. He sent it to the prosecutors immediately, flagging it with the message, "Use this before they bury her twice." Meanwhile, Marla Chen reached out. Her upcoming report would focus on the aftermath, how Elena's warnings had gone ignored, how systems meant to protect her had failed, and how Garrett had stepped in to fix what he once didn't see. She asked to interview Sophie. Garrett refused. "Her story doesn't belong to the public," he said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Marla understood. Instead, Garrett offered her something else, an email Elena had once written to a nonprofit, pleading for protection. In it, Elena wrote, "I don't want justice. I want safety. I want my children to grow up without fear." It was the emotional core Marla needed, and it reframed the entire case. As the hearing approached, Garrett sat with Sophie on the back porch. The night was quiet. Aiden had already gone to bed. "Will they talk about Mommy in court?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, but I'll be there the whole time." "Will they say bad things about her?" Garrett hesitated. "They might try." Sophie was quiet, then said, "But we know the truth." He smiled and took her hand. "Yes, we do." The next morning, Garrett put on his suit. Not for a meeting, not for power, but for Elena, for Sophie, for Aiden. He looked at his reflection one last time and said softly, "Let's finish this." The courtroom was colder than Garrett expected. Rows of reporters filled the gallery, though cameras weren't allowed. At the front, Victor Lang sat with his legal team, immaculately dressed but visibly thinner. He hadn't spoken to the press in weeks, and for the first time, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked cornered. Garrett sat behind the prosecution's table. He wasn't required to be there, but he came anyway. Not to watch Victor fall, but to make sure Elena's voice would finally be heard. The judge called the session to order. Victor's defense launched first, leaning into their narrative. Elena Hale, a woman with a history of emotional instability, had manufactured a false reality. They painted her as erratic, suggested the recordings were faked, the shelter a convenient cover for delusions. They even referenced medical reports, carefully curated, to imply she had a history of paranoia. Garrett clenched his fists beneath the table. But then the prosecution stood, and they began to play the second recording. Elena's voice filled the courtroom, raw, shaky, real. "He came again today. Victor. He said if I ever told anyone about the account transfers, about the voice messages, he'd make sure no one ever believed me. He said my kids would be taken from me if I even tried to run again." There was a long pause. "I know what I sound like. I know people think women like me exaggerate. But if anything happens to me, if this ends the way I fear it might, just promise me someone will find my kids. Keep them safe. I don't care if they know the truth about me. Just keep them safe." The courtroom went completely silent. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. The prosecution continued. They introduced shelter records, medical documents from Elena's final months, testimony from caseworkers, and the statement from Brent Collins, Victor's former assistant. All of it aligned, all of it damning. Then they called Garrett to the stand. He took a deep breath and faced the room. For a moment he saw the faces, not just of lawyers and journalists, but of Sophie and Aiden in his memory. Of Elena, smiling nervously at him years ago in a coffee shop on their first date. He cleared his throat. "My name is Garrett Hale. I'm a father. I didn't know I was until recently. And I'm here because the woman I loved spent the last years of her life hiding from a man who abused his power. I failed her once by not believing her. I won't fail her again." The prosecutor asked him why he believed Elena's story. He opened Elena's journal, flipping to the final page. He held it up. "Because she never stopped protecting our children. Even when she thought she was alone." Victor's team attempted to object. They tried to delay the hearing, filed motions for dismissal. But the momentum had turned. The evidence was too strong. The public pressure too loud. By day's end, the court ordered a full criminal trial against Victor Lang to proceed, with pre-trial restrictions imposed immediately. His assets were frozen, his travel suspended, and a gag order silenced his legal team. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Garrett didn't speak. He went home. That night, Sophie was waiting by the window. She ran to him the moment he stepped inside, hugging him around the waist. "Did you win?" she asked. He knelt. "Not yet, but we're close." "Did they hear her?" He nodded. They did. Sophie handed him something, a small rose she had picked from the garden Olivia planted last week. "Can we go tomorrow? To see her?" Garrett blinked back tears. "Yeah, I'd like that." The next morning, under a clear sky, Garrett stood once again at Elena's grave. This time, he wasn't alone. Sophie stood beside him, holding Aiden's hand. She placed the rose gently on the stone and whispered, "We found you, Mommy. And he found us too." Garrett knelt, his hands resting on their small shoulders. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. Elena was gone, but her voice had changed everything. Months later, Garrett sat on the porch of a modest two-story house just outside the city, a far cry from the glass penthouse he once called home. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, lived in, real. Inside, Aiden was stacking blocks while Sophie read aloud from a picture book, her voice growing steadier with every page. Laughter floated through the screen door, the kind of laughter Garrett used to hear in commercials and mistake for fiction. He had chosen this new home deliberately, close to good schools, far from headlines. A place with a backyard, a garden, and a room filled with sunlight that Sophie now called her own. Victor Lang's trial had begun. The evidence was overwhelming. Public opinion had turned. Whistleblowers had multiplied. And Brent's final testimony, delivered with the weight of remorse, had sealed Victor's fate. Garrett had refused interviews. He no longer cared about the narrative others told. He had his own story now. On a quiet Sunday morning, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with Sophie. She was working on a school project, a timeline of her life. She had glued photos onto construction paper, a picture from the shelter, one from the safe house, and now a newer one of her, Aiden and Garrett in the backyard. "What's this one called?" she asked, pointing to the latest photo. Garrett smiled. "That's the day we made it home." She nodded. "I'm putting it in the middle." "Not the end?" "Nope," she said. "It's not over yet." He felt something swell in his chest. Pride, grief, gratitude. All of it, tangled together. Later that afternoon, Sophie stood by the small garden they'd planted together. She picked a single red rose and looked at Garrett. "Can we go see her again?" He nodded. At the cemetery, Sophie placed the rose gently on Elena's grave. Aiden stood beside her, holding Garrett's hand. "She'd like the garden," Sophie said softly. "She'd love it," Garrett replied. Then he whispered, mostly to himself, "We're okay now, Elena. They're safe. You can rest." Sinchos, and for the first time since she left, he felt the truth of those words. They weren't just surviving. They were living. 1 year later, a letter arrived in Garrett's mailbox, postmarked from the shelter where Elena had once stayed. Inside was a photograph he'd never seen before. Elena, holding both children, smiling with tired but joyful eyes. On the back, written in her handwriting, were 5 words. "You found us. Thank you." Garrett placed the photo on the mantel beside a new family portrait. Sophie had just started 2nd grade. Aiden now ran everywhere and called him Dad, without hesitation. And every morning Garrett woke up not to silence, but to life. A life Elena had made possible. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who needs a reminder that love, truth, and redemption can still break through, even in the darkest moments. Let us know in the comments, what part of this journey moved you the most? And if you believe in the power of stories to heal and connect, consider subscribing for more narratives that go beyond the surface and into the soul. Thank you for being here. Your presence means more than you know.